for the last 2 years, we've been invited to law enforcement, judicial associations, schools, police departments, law firms, district attorneys' offices, public defenders, to share the information about the phenomena that I'll be talking about. And nowhere on our website, of course I'll recommend you look at our website, nowhere on our website does it say anything about providing these information sessions. I like to call them trailers for the movie. Nowhere does it say that we do that, but people find, it's very exciting, people often find the information so interesting that through word of mouth, the idea that there may be some answers to, again, what I mentioned as the racial paradox, I think provides a sense of excitement and hope even in these bleak times. For the last 2 summers, I've been going around the country working with community groups, and I have to say, again, as I said, I've been a civil rights lawyer for 25 years. The last 2 summers have been different than any in my lifetime. And we know why they've been different. We know, Jason described this so eloquently, we know the pain that is felt in communities, and the pain seems particularly acute for 2 groups. And again, Jason mentioned this. The 2 groups would be in communities of color, and particularly mothers. I've had mothers weep because of the fear of what might happen to their sons particularly. And then police officers. Police officers feel, as Jason described, under siege. And so we have this sort of double paradox where on the one hand, we have research suggesting that the vast majority of Americans think racism is not only wrong, but it's immoral. There was a study done in Georgia that asked people to rate kind of what constitutes immorality. And being racist came in as more immoral than being a drunk driver, and second only to pedophilia. So being racist is immoral. Now we're in an unusual time right now because in this somewhat unusual election season, there's language and discussion that in some sense we haven't heard in a while in a public space, but I would still contend that the idea of being racist continues to be something that the vast majority of Americans reject as un-American. And so that again brings us to this paradox where most people reject racism. The vast majority of men and women who go into law enforcement respect the rule of law, and yet the feeling in the country is it doesn't feel that way. It doesn't feel like the vast majority of Americans, particularly whites, let's be honest, reject racism. And to some communities, it certainly doesn't feel like the vast majority of law enforcement respect the rule of law, but as Jason said, that creates an enormous challenge for those in law enforcement because they're then painted with the brush of the worst of them. So what we do is we describe 3 phenomena: implicit bias, racial anxiety, and stereotype threat, as helping us to understand how it can be the case that people can simultaneously, genuinely reject racism, and yet in our behavior, it may not seem like that. Because that can be weird, right? Because sometimes there'll be skeptics in the audience, and the skeptics will fall into 2 camps. One camp will say, well, again, let's be honest, the white people who claim we reject racism, maybe we're just lying. Maybe we're just saying what we think is politically correct, and we don't really mean it. And then others of us will say, we know genuinely in our hearts that we think racism is wrong, so maybe the claims that racism is so pronounced are people being oversensitive. And so we'll have these 2 camps, and then it becomes difficult to have a dialogue. Now I think in these times, the oversensitive line just doesn't work anymore. And that's not something that anyone can really say with any seriousness. But it still becomes this challenging question. If we're all being genuine, why is this so challenging? So I bring it to science. Now what does coffee have to do with science? There was an experiment that asked, does it matter if when you meet someone new, they're holding a hot cup of coffee or a cold iced tea or glass of ice water? No, it shouldn't matter, right? That seems completely irrelevant. But it turns out that if someone is holding a hot cup of coffee when they meet someone for the first time, they perceive that person as warmer and more likable.
Thank you, Dunkin' Donuts.
Thank you, Dunkin' Donuts. Exactly. When Jason told me he was having Dunkin' Donuts coffee, I said, making sure it's not the iced coffee, because I want everyone to like me and everyone else in the family. So it turns out that it actually does matter. If you're holding the iced tea and you meet someone for the first time, there's a sense of distance or chill. And that seems kind of silly, but at the same time, we know if we have a job interview and we're meeting someone, their first impressions of us matter. So there are a whole host of sort of things that seem irrelevant that actually affect the way that we perceive each other. And the reason I know about this study is because one of my colleagues at Seton Hall Law School, when I started to do this work on race, said, Rachel, why are you focusing so much on race? There's all sorts of ways in which people respond because of their unconscious. And he told me about this study, and I went and read the study, and in fact, he was right, the study's true. But my response to him was, any one of us could be the beneficiary of the warm cup of coffee, right? Any one of us, whatever our race, ethnicity, gender, religion, and any of us could be the victim of the ice water. But it's kind of random. Race and gender are not random. We carry those with us, whatever people are holding. And so if there's a way in which there's something in our unconscious that affects how we perceive people that leads to, as Jason described, people reacting differently and seeing the behavior differently if it's behavior conducted by a young black man than a young white man, that matters, and that matters in a systematic way that can be life-threatening. So, again, there may be some skeptics in the room still that something in our unconscious can matter that much. Because, we're thinking people, right? So how can it be that our unconscious matters? So what I'm going to ask you to do is engage in an interactive exercise with me. This is why I shut the lights off so we can see the text. And my ask is to please state the color of the text that you see. So let's do a quick trial run. As a group, loudly, with energy. I like it, thank you. Okay, we had some coffee here, hopefully some donuts. Sugar helps too. All right, so I'm going to have a whole kind of many examples, and as a group, as loudly and quickly as you can, simply state the color of the text. Okay, ready?
Blue, red, green, black, green, red, blue, black, red, blue, green, black,
all right, so we had, the group was doing fabulously. The group was doing fabulously for the first line. Like, we were rocking it for the first line, right? And then something happened right around the second group of letters that were black, where somehow we went awry, and it's not a racial issue. So what happened? Why, after the second grouping, did, frankly, you guys stop stating the color of the words? What happened?
reading the words.
You were reading the words. Now, it could be that you were reading the words because you thought this was stupid, and why am I asking you to state the color of the text? But I think you're a really nice group of people. So I think it wasn't that you were intentionally not doing what I asked of you. Am I right about that?
Yeah.
Right? So, because your intention, your conscious intention was to state the color of the text, why'd you read? So, okay, that's right. So we began, now again, I asked you to state the color of the text, but someone correctly pointed out that in the beginning, the color of the text and the word were the same, right? So there was synchronicity in the color of the text and the word, and so arguably I primed you, right? You kind of went along happily reading and thinking that you were stating the color of the text, but maybe really you were reading all along. But even so, even if that's so, once we got here, you knew that there was no longer the synchronicity. You could tell. And yet still, it became difficult. So now you know my trick. So I primed you. Actually, it's not because this was invented in 1935 by Mr. Stroop. It has nothing to do with me. So you know my trick. You know that in order to do this test correctly, you can't read, right? You have to just state the color of the text. So let's try one more time. I've given you it's completely transparent. I've given you the tricks. Let's see if we can do it, okay? This front row, second row, everyone engage, okay? Do your best. So, ready?
Ready.
Blue.
Same energy.
Red. Green. Black. Green. Black. Red. Green. 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 Red. Blue. Black.
So even though you knew the trick, it's still difficult, right? It's really weirdly hard to do this test. And it's weirdly hard because what do most of us do all the time when we see words? We read them, right? So we're taught from the time that we start in school, you see a word and you read it. So we're accustomed to doing that. And so even when the task is different, your conscious mind wants to state the color of the text because you're such nice people. And this was my ask. And yet, your unconscious, your habits, what you generally do all the time, is so powerful that it overcame the conscious intention to do the test even the second time around, right? So the reason that Jason likes this test and the reason that I do this with every group of judges and police officers and teachers and doctors, every group that I talk to, I share this test because anyone who came in firmly convinced, and judges I can tell you are firmly convinced that their conscious minds can overcome any unconscious. But anyone who's convinced of that has to at least have a little bit of recognition. In this instance, at least, my conscious mind wasn't powerful enough to overcome my unconscious. And right now, what science tells us is that our unconscious processes 11 million bits of information in the time that our conscious brains process 40 bits of information, which is a really powerful difference. But if you look around, that makes sense. Like, look at the beautiful dresses that some of the ladies are wearing, the interesting patterned shirts. If we just lost ourselves in all that stimuli, we couldn't listen to anything else, right? So our brains have to be really good at distinguishing between what we pay attention to and what we don't. And that's what brings us to what implicit bias is and why it's so powerful. Implicit bias is the instant association of stereotypes, traits, or attitudes toward groups of people that we're not even aware is happening. Because our brain is really good at quickly processing information, putting it into categories, and that includes people. And particularly police officers have to be able to act instantaneously. They have to be able to act quickly. But what we know is the associations that our country has imposed upon some groups of people, and particularly African American men, are so pernicious and distorted that our brains overcome our conscious values too often and are the source of some of the tragedies. Now the good news is, sit down in 22 seconds, the good news is our implicit biases don't have to dictate our behavior. We're at risk of having them dictate our behavior, but once we know that they're in our brains, we can begin the process of reducing those biases, delinking the stereotypes from the people, and having a sense of people as individuals and authentic people with their whole fullness. And frankly, what you're doing tonight is one of the most powerful ways to reduce implicit bias. You're interacting with donuts as equals, as peers, and getting to know each other as individuals, to see each other not as members of a group, but as individuals who are multiplicities, who have so many different identities. And that's one of the most powerful ways to reduce implicit bias. There are more, but I'll just end with one of the other phenomena, because I think it's so important to be aware of this, and particularly in having a conversation like the one we're about to have. So racial anxiety refers to the concern that people often have when they're about to interact with someone of another group. And it's experienced by people of all ethnicities and races sometimes. If you're a person of color, your fear may be, if you're going to interact with someone white, am I going to experience stereotyping, hostility, or distant treatment? Is this person going to treat me badly or differently because of my race? And that there's a lot of reason to have that concern. For whites, most of us don't really know that we feel this. Our concern often is, are we going to say or do something that's going to cause the person we're talking to think we're racist? And anxiety tends to make people armor up and stand back and not engage. And anxiety can look like hostility. And so we can both have fears that prevent us from achieving what we both want, which is to engage warmly and authentically. And so what I would ask, I was so excited to learn about a study that said just knowing about this idea of racial anxiety can help us overcome it so that we don't, without realizing it, confirm those fears. And so I would ask us in this conversation, everyone here is obviously in this room because you want to have an authentic dialogue about the challenges the Teaneck faces. And so if we can, again, bring the knowledge that we're here to engage into the room, hopefully racial anxieties won't interrupt the engagement and the implicit bias reduction can occur. So thank you all so much.